Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to continue our discussions on MKULTRA and beyond, the government experiments in behavior modification and mind control. In case you didn't see my first video, which was on the strange death of Dr. Frank Olson, just to give you a super quick backstory, between two novels, Lake City and Island X, I decided I was going to take little breaks and read the CREST, that's the CIA's search record tool website, and I was thinking of debunking some of the more wild MKUltra experiments and things like that. And the more I read, the more I realized they were true and sometimes worse. And this was coming from the CIA. I used primarily the CREST website of the declassified FOIA documents. Then I also used the written press and the media at the time, like say the Washington Post, the New York Times, that were reporting on these incidents and doing interviews with the folks involved. So you also have the press of the actual subject that would go and talk about it maybe decades later. So I added that in. I added in anything else that I could find. So that is where my knowledge bank is coming from. It's not coming from YouTube. It's not coming from wild conspiracy theorists. It's not coming from just crazy places. It's coming from legitimate sources. But I do encourage the watcher to do your own research to further reveal any truths about these formerly secret projects and all the sub-projects that were birthed from MKUltra. I just think it's important to encourage the truth to come out and to stop these excesses, these abuses, and that they shouldn't recur ever again. And I think part of being on the right side of history and the right side of humanity is admitting what we did in the past, admitting that, and then moving forward, not doing it again, not just taking the sub-project that's been discovered and then shutting it down and then saying to the public, we shut it down, but then meanwhile, the things that you're still working on, the little tentacles, feeding them into another project, renaming it, maybe moving it to another department and keeping it going. That's unethical. It's immoral. It's illegal. So, sorry, I have a hair on my ring. That is my backstory on why I did this and what it's all about. So this video is about Harold Blauer and Army Project Pelican. I hope to get savvy enough in my video editing to start adding pictures so that you don't have to sit there and listen, look at my mug. You can look at the person and look at the documents, and that would be way more edifying, don't you think? So I hope I can do that as I'm editing. So let's talk about Harold Blauer and Army Project Pelican. Before the death of Frank Olson, that whole situation that went on the video before, Harold Blauer, he's a 42-year-old tennis professional. He checks himself in willingly to the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And I'm going to say allegedly one of those hospitals that's affiliated with the CIA program. Does that mean that every doctor that worked there was CIA? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that there were some projects going on there at that time. He's suffering from depression following a broken marriage. So he goes and he is forward thinking for that time, 1953. He goes in and he checks himself in to get help. He's not driven away, kicking and screaming or anything like that. He's getting himself treatment. However, he then becomes an unwitting victim of an experiment to which he didn't give any kind of consent. Over a span of days, he's injected with 5 heavy doses of mescaline. It's a mescaline derivative, and I believe it was EA-1298, or known as MDA. But he got 5 heavy doses, which was secretly being tested by the Army Chemical Corps. So again, it ties in with the Army Chemical Corps. These institutions, these agencies do not usually operate in a vacuum. If you're going to test drugs on people, that agency, that alphabet agency that we were talking about, doesn't usually just have the drugs. Sometimes they do. Maybe the Army does. Or, so they don't operate in a vacuum, so keep that in mind. Blauer did not react well to the 4th injection. On January 8, 1953, over his objection, moments after receiving the 5th dose, and that was his final injection, he got 450 milligrams of MDA, 4.5 times a recreational dose. he begins sweating profusely, flailing his arms around, and has to be restrained. So think, he's gone in there for talk therapy for his depression, and then they're like, hey, we've got some drugs for you to take. They don't get his consent. Consent's real important, otherwise you're going to get your pantsuit off of you. And they know this. They don't give his consent that, about the drugs, what it is, or anything like that. So at 10:01 a.m., his body stiffens up and he's frothing at the mouth. He lapses into a coma and dies at 12:15. He wasn't the only person who was being tested at this time period at this place. They had test patients and they were dosing them in intervals. And due to Blauer's freaking out and having such a bad reaction on his on that final dose, the next patient that was due to get their dose only got a partial dose because they're like, oh, this one's freaking out. Obviously that's too heavy of a dose. Give them half a dose, half of the 450. And that patient, when he recovered, said, quote, I've been in hell. Why did they put me in hell? These are people that go in there for depression, and they are literally being tortured. So the doctor has a written report, right? You're doing these tests. You just have a regular patient. You've got reports. So in his written report said that the injections were for diagnostic purposes, and they covered up the experiment. Of course they did. The state of New York, the CIA, and the Army, they're all involved in Army Project Pelican. So there's plenty of blame to spread around here. You also, of course, have the doctors that are doing these experiments, right? Stay pressed. The New York State Psychiatric Institute informed the Army Chemical Corps of Blauer's death, and the Army starts covering its tracks. Now think, have you ever gone to a hospital and had an injection, or any kind of hospital had an injection and had them go, oh, let me give the Army a call as to its efficacy? No, that was a project and the Army was involved. The Army instructs the doctors at the hospital to temporarily discontinue the experiment. And on January 10th, Dr. Amedeo Marazi, and remember that name Marazi because he's involved in more than one project. He's the guy that synthesized the drug, the mescaline. And he was also the project officer in charge of the contract. He goes to the Psychiatric Institute to speak with Dr. Paul Hawk and Dr. James Cattell to learn how Blauer died and to obtain the records. The autopsy shows that Blauer died of circulatory collapse and sudden death due to an IV injection of synthetic mescaline. He's their guinea pig, and that guinea pig has died, and they're going to go and try to figure out why the guinea pig died. Did you give the guinea pig too much medication? Did you give the guinea pig the medication too close to another dose? Is there something awry in how you gave the guinea pig the medication? And after interviewing everybody involved and telling them not to continue until safety measures were in place, Marazi later recommends the continuation of the experiments. Again, now you have not only liability and culpability for what you did to Blauer, you've got that in spades, double, triple for what everyone that happens after that, because you already had someone that died due to this and you knew it and you kept doing it. But let's just carry on, right? What's the worth of a guinea pig? Marazi, he also prevailed on the New York City Medical Examiner to place Blauer's autopsy records in a confidential file. Like Olson's family before, Blauer's family was told a half-truth, that he died of an overdose of a drug and nothing more. That's what they said. So they've done something very horrific, and then they go and they cover it up. So in 1952 through 1953, Dr. Paul H. Hawk, he was working with the CIA and the SOD on a 2-year, $1 million mescaline study called Project Pelican, and it was going down at the New York Psychiatric Institute. And the U.S. Army Chemical Corps was the one, they were providing the LSD, and its contract with the Psychiatric Institute prohibited the disclosure of the Army's involvement. So we're getting sticky here. Lots of fingers in these experimental pies. According to the book Acid Dreams, The Complete Social History of LSD, Dr. Hawk, quote, gave LSD to psychiatric patients and then lobotomized them in order to compare the effects of the acid before and after the psychosurgery. Let that sink in. That is torture. You have someone that's come in for help to these institutes. They're given LSD and they're lobotomized so that you can compare before and after. Are you kidding me? Hawk gave an interview later that he found transorbital lobotomy was statistically less effective than other operations. So it really didn't even work. He remarked that initially the patients did well, but then they tended to relapse, like into depression or whatever reason they were brought into or check themselves into the psychiatric institute. Now, we've said a lot, right? But we still haven't talked about consent. These patients didn't give consent. They didn't know what they were getting into. If they had been honest, the people would not have given them their consent, and that is why they did it this way. And to think, who are they preying on? Are they preying on the healthy people in a hospital? No, they're preying on people who are already mentally unwell. And you would even argue whether they could have given proper consent even if they were to agree to it, but they didn't. So, I don't want to get all heated up, but it gets you heated. In April of 1953, Mrs. Amy Blauer, his ex-wife, gotta love a good ex-wife, brought a lawsuit against the state of New York without knowledge of the true facts of his death. She just knew something was hinky and that more than likely they're liable for his death. So during the lawsuit, a firm who's representing her, they're led to believe through the discovery process that he died from an atypical reaction to a drug administered for his diagnosis and therapy, i.e. they're basically saying it was an accident and whatever we did was for his benefit and it was just an accident, was atypical. But during the discovery process, the estate is not given all the patient's records. They certainly aren't informed about a confidential project, any kind of classified documents. So an offer of $15,000 is on the table. And more than likely, it would have been just settled right there. This is the part that gets tricky, so I want to make it clear to the layperson. In 1955, the state of New York cannot settle a case against itself without presenting evidence of prima facie liability to the Court of Claims. So if you're going to settle and the money's going to come out of the coffers, you have to give prima facie, it means just like basic, prima, like on its face, evidence on its face that you're liable. So it has to go through. And what happened is before following this procedure of the prima facie giving of the basis, David Marcus, that's the plaintiff's attorney assigned to the case, he reveals the Army's involvement to the judge in an ex parte conference. Yeah. Right. So, Judge Motley, he finds that the attorney David Marcus, quote, he did in fact work to conceal the Army's involvement throughout the litigation and the settlement negotiations carried on in New York. So, years later, looking back at this, Judge Motley finds that David Marcus worked to conceal the Army's involvement. So he was helping to conceal it too throughout the litigation and the settlement negotiations. Because honestly, if New York could have just settled it out and not have to give in any kind of prima facie evidence, I don't even know if this would have been dug back up again. At least not in this format. But it was. This is how this pops out. Because the state of New York raised the settlement then, because then they realized, oh dear, they raised it to $18,000 because they realized there's really some culpability there. Half of that $18,000 was to be paid surreptitiously by the Army in order to keep its role secret. So then they go, so the guy's meeting with the judge in the back and he's like, here's our prima facie. Here's the problem here, judge. The problem here is it's a top secret, project. And so, yeah, you're liable. And then they're like, oh, damn, let's raise it up to $18,000 and let's just make her take it and let's just be done. And who's going to pay for it? Well, 9 will come from the Army and 9 will come from us and let's just shut this up. Are you kidding me? In 1975, a congressional inquiry This is 1975, so let's think. 55, 20 years later, a congressional inquiry uncovers the documents about Blauer's demise, and only then does the Army notify his family about the true circumstances surrounding his death. 20 years later. So an official from the Pentagon, the good old Pentagon, comes to the house and tells the family that they found papers at the Edgewood Arsenal. Again, that's an offshoot of it's over back near Fort Detrick, or on Fort Detrick's property, with information regarding their father's death contained therein. And, quote, it was diagnosed that the drug compounds injected into Mr. Blauer had been supplied by the United States Army as part of a chemical warfare experiment. 20 years later, they tell him. Because it's also going to pop out on the congressional on the floor with all these committees and stuff too. So you got to think, you think they really did this admissions out of the goodness of their hearts? So after the Army Chemical Corps revealed its role, the Blauer's daughters, they initiate a series of lawsuits. Wouldn't you? His daughter Elizabeth Barrett sued on behalf of the estate via her attorney Eugene R. Scheinman. Litigation extends for more than 10 years. In 1987, they're eventually awarded $700,000 in damages. $500,000 of that damage was for physical suffering. So they're admitting there was a ton of physical suffering that was experienced by Mr. Blauer. Although he held a security clearance to actually give the drugs, the lawsuit revealed that Dr. James Cattell, the guy at the Institute, was the doctor who actually injected Blauer that day. He later claimed not to even know what he was injecting. And he claimed, here's the quote he gave, you gotta love it. We didn't know whether it was dog piss. It was a secret. We weren't let in on it. So to add insult to injury, these doctors that were on this contract to actually inject this stuff didn't even know what the hell they were injecting into these guinea pigs. Does that not make you kind of even more angry? Like, who the heck would do that? The district judge, Constance Baker Motley, she is one of those Motley crew that you just want to have on your case. She heard this case. Because think, it's gone 10 years past the admission in 1975, and the death happened in 1953. So I think, personally, if it was me and I was a family member and this shenanigans had gone on, I think my anger with every decade would rise. I don't think I would become less angry about it. And in fact, I think I'd even want even more money. And then I'd take that money to expose these excesses. So the district judge, Constance Baker Motley, she hears the case and she wrote, quote, the case arises from the death of Harold Blauer, a mental patient who died in 1953 as a guinea pig in an experiment to test potential chemical warfare agents for the United States Army. So she recognizes that. And she notes, under the contracts, the Army would supply certain chemical derivatives of mescaline to the Institute for studies on its psychiatric patients. At the time of the event, these chemicals were considered classified by the Army Chemical Corps, as well as the experiment itself, in order to investigate the military potential of these drugs. She also remarked from the facts and evidence that, quote, it was well known in the early 1950s that a change in the side chain of a molecule could radically alter the effect of the chemical on the human body. In particular, it was known that changing a side chain could increase the toxicity of a given chemical compound tremendously. So basically, in this lawsuit, they even got a lot of scientific information in front of the judge to show not only the shenanigans that were involved, but also the science behind it, and behind changing a side chain on a molecule and how it can just change the initial drug so drastically. She concluded, the judge concluded that the injections Blauer received were not intended to serve any kind of diagnostic or therapeutic purpose, not in anybody's imagination. For him personally, it was not going to help him at all. She also noted that the primary reason the Army covered up its involvement was to avoid adverse publicity and embarrassment. The Army was testing chemical welfare agents on civilians, and they did not want to deal with the embarrassment and the adverse publicity. Blauer's daughter had an opinion, and she said, "I think they murdered him." They had a drug to test, and that's all they cared about. They made him suffer terribly, and there was no need for any of that. I just wanted to say that this is the kind of stuff that MKULTRA ended up spawning. Project Pelican was one of the ones that really was more Army based, but this is the kind of stuff that went on, and the goal was to track it down to when it started happening here and where it ends. And so far, I don't know where it ends. I don't know when we've stopped. Some of the powers that be have said that we don't do any kind of this kind of stuff anymore, especially without consent. Sure, people do drug trials every day, and they give proper informed consent, and they're also compensated many times for their participation in drug trials. Back in the day, looks like they were finding people who were vulnerable, or people that you were that were obligated to do what you told them, like if you were someone in the Army, and they simply had their way with you. And it's sad. I just want to say, ironically, some benefits did come out of the experiment. So, want to hear what the benefits were for this experiment? Many doctors were able to publish books and papers on LSD, like Dr. Amado Esmarazzi et al., who wrote, I found this paper, Quantified LSD's Effects on Ego Strength, and he wrote that in 1966. So, you know what? Some doctors got to put feathers in their caps about this. So, isn't that sweet and nice? So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry for the awkwardness, but it's very cold. It's very cold outside, and I have no interest in it. So, if you did like this video, please push that little like button and ring that subscribe bell. And the next sub-project that I'm going to talk about is sub-project 5 and 43. There's 2 sub-projects actually, and it's about hypnosis under MKUltra. And I hope you enjoy this and have an excellent day. Bye.